Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 149 and I am the show's host Kyle. Joining me on today's show is Will Porter. Will Porter is a journalist, a freelance journalist who is an expert in Middle East affairs and American foreign policy. His work can be found at thelibertarianinstitute.org and antiwar.com. Hey Will, thanks for coming on the show today.
I'm always glad to join you, man. Thank you for having me.
Got Will on for a pretty interesting and special show today, and that is because Trump just gave his first, State of the Union speech. His last one, I think, was just a joint address to Congress. As Will is well aware right now, because we're recording this show pretty much right after listening to the actual State of the Union, it was quite the long one. I don't know if it was quite a record, Will, but I think it probably clocked into close to that.
Yeah, definitely. It was almost an hour and a half, I think.
Right. I know like an hour in, I was messaging Will concerned that we weren't going to have enough content, but then about an hour and 15 minutes in, he went heavy on foreign policy, so me and Will have an awful lot to say and to react to. What we did here is we kind of compiled the clips and summarized them, cutting out a few things. One, the massive amount of applause, which went on forever, and it was probably pretty equal to the amount of time that Trump actually spent speaking. And then we also cut out Trump's three anecdotal stories, one of somebody who was injured in Raqqa, one about Otto Warmbier, who was the American citizen who was arrested and punished and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in North Korea, who later died after being transported back to the United States. And then the third was this North Korean refugee escapee who was, I don't know, was he a quadriplegic or a paraplegic, Will? I forget. But anyways, this guy has an absolutely heroic story, and, now what he does is try to help people who escape from North Korea. Trump goes on forever, and there's a lot of applause there. So we just decided to cut that out so we could get through to the real policy stuff for you. Will, do you have anything you would like to add, or we should preface this show with just in the context of what Trump said here today?
I think we can jump into it and then kind of get into it from there.
All right, and so we'll go ahead and play clip one.
We are also restoring our strength and standing abroad. Around the world, we face rogue regimes, terrorist groups, and rivals like China and Russia that challenge our interests, our economy, and our values. In confronting these horrible dangers, we know that weakness is the surest path to conflict, and unmatched power is the surest means to our true and great defense. For this reason, I am asking Congress to end the dangerous defense sequester and fully fund our great military.
All right, well, so going back to the start of the clip, and even before the State of the Union, we are talking about what Trump might say, and we pretty much hit the first three things out of his mouth, which are talking about rogue regimes, terrorist groups in Russia and China. So Trump presents these as threats to the United States. Will, let's just look at that real quick.
Yeah, sure. So I think this first clip we're looking at here, it's his first sort of introductory statement in the foreign policy realm. He had made some offhanded remarks about terrorism and stuff earlier, but mostly he wanted to relate this to crime and immigration. And so what he's really doing in this first clip here is he is sort of framing the whole issue. And as we covered on the show, Trump's national security strategy, this is sort of the similar framing that he adopts in that document. And so, as you said, the three sort of parties, the rogue regimes of Iran and North Korea, the regional powers such as China and Russia, and then terror groups, Islamic terror groups like ISIS. And another way that Trump tries to frame this here is, he says weakness is the path to conflict. So he's sort of saying, we can't capitulate to our enemies. However, it seems a little bizarre because weakness is not really, I guess it depends on how you define weakness, but certainly we have presented ourselves with strength in the sense of bombing and aggression and, just throwing our weight around the world. And so to refer to this history as weakness is kind of a alarming way to frame this.
Absolutely. I think it's just amazing that, Trump kind of gets away with saying that these people are our enemies when it really doesn't make any sense. If you look at the actual threats that Russia would provide to the United States, you really can't find any. What they always impose is this idea of Russian aggression, and that Russia has invaded Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. However, in Syria, Russia was invited by Assad, and Assad was a long-standing ally of Russia, and maintaining the central government there is something that is not in violation of international law and the established norms, which the United States is constantly complaining about Russia violating, pointing to Ukraine, where it was the United States-backed coup that prompted the people of Crimea to secede and then later vote to join Russia. So it really wasn't Russia actively doing anything other than once the people of Crimea have voted to rejoin the Russian Federation, that Putin then just secured that for those people. And in Georgia, the United States was training some pretty unsavory characters there, including the former ISIS, I guess, field commander Omar the Chechen. And yeah. So, there's real reason to believe that, what was going on there may not have been Russian aggression, but United States aggression.
You're absolutely right about that. And just another thing about Russia, I would say, too, is that, yes, despite the fact that Russia does have, a hydrogen bomb arsenal, they do have a military force. When we're talking about Russia's economic capabilities, we're talking about, not a very large economy here. I believe Russia's economy is the size of California's. So that's sort of, I don't know, that might help to put the threat into perspective of Russia.
Yeah, I think Ray McGovern always says something about it being Manhattan, that the entire Russian economy is the size of Manhattan's, making a joke off of the Sarah Palin blunder. I could see Russia from my front porch in Alaska. So the other thing mentioned here was the sequester. And this is something personal experience from my background. When I was, I believe, in college debate, one of the things that came up pretty frequently was the sequester. And all the political analysts and the pundits were calling this, and so then all the debaters were citing these people, saying that this was a doomsday device that was going to completely blow up the American government and the American military. Obviously, that hasn't happened, but just like pretty much anything in foreign policy, all the lies continue to come back over and over again. And so while the United States has carried out massive projects, such as updating cruise missiles, updating and building a new fighter jet, and then passing upgrades to the nuclear triad, so including new submarines and new long-range bombers, they continue to complain that the military budget is being cut and the military is depleted.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, if you follow the research of an organization called the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, they show that the American military budget is larger than the next 7 countries combined, the next 7 largest militaries. And so to define this, to frame this position as one of weakness and one of helplessness or something is just, it's preposterous.
It's so unfortunate, too, because you could imagine that Donald Trump could also say, China spends $200 billion on their military. Americans could do 4 times as much with the Chinese than with half the money, kind of making America out to be great that way. But he doesn't do that. He says America needs to outspend China by 5 or 6 times the amount in order just to, keep up and make sure they don't become a threat to the United States. And so it's so cowardly and so foolish.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we can move on to the next clip, Will.
We must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression by any other nation or anyone else. Perhaps someday in the future there will be a magical moment when the countries of the world will get together to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, sadly.
Okay, well, so as I alluded to before, the United States is upgrading our nuclear arsenal and our nuclear triad, and Trump now apparently thinks this is the most important thing in the world when candidate Trump had no idea what it was. So do you want to talk a little bit about the U.S. military spending there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's sort of piggybacking on my last point, America's nuclear arsenal is already the largest in terms of the stockpile and the I'm not sure in terms of active warheads, but I know we do have the largest nuclear arsenal. Now, Trump could have really taken an easier way here. He could have, because Barack Obama is the one who embarked on sort of revitalizing the nuclear arsenal. And I think Trump could have made that a point of opposition. He could have said, we need to stop this wasteful spending on the nuclear arsenal. However, of course, he doubles down on it, insists that it's more vital than ever to have a, massive nuclear arsenal. And so I think he really kind of squandered an opportunity there.
Right, I agree. I mean, it seems like he knows that it's desirable to have no nuclear weapons and calls it a magical day. But yet, we're kind of moving in the opposite direction here and on a policy that he's, deliberately supporting. So I think that's problematic. Also, Trump sees nuclear deterrence as being a way for the United States to enforce world peace, but yet, calls Kim Jong-un a nut job later on in the speech for, advocating a policy of nuclear deterrence in North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you'll forgive a minor digression here, America has a long-standing policy of backing Israel, and Israel's had this policy, what it calls nuclear ambiguity, where it sort of kind of hides whether it does have a nuclear arsenal or not. However, it's pretty well known among analysts that Israel indeed does have a nuclear arsenal, and they are not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they are quite literally a rogue nuclear arsenal with the absolute support of America. And so if there's one thing we could possibly do to reduce proliferation risk, especially in the Middle East, in this volatile region, it would be to rein in Israel's nuclear program, or at least not to support them so directly in that. But yet, nonetheless, we fail to do so.
Right, and I believe both India and Pakistan are also not members of the NPT. And while Pakistan isn't a great ally of the United States, India is certainly becoming more and more of a partner with the United States. And so, again, there are other places we could apply pressure if, that was the way to, what we were trying to achieve, a nuclear-free world.
Certainly.
All right, well, let's move on to clip number 3.
Last year, I also pledged that we would work with our allies to extinguish ISIS from the face of the earth. 1 year later, I am proud to report that the coalition to defeat ISIS has liberated very close to 100% of the territory just recently held by these killers in Iraq and in Syria and in other locations as well. But there is much more work to be done. We will continue our fight until ISIS is defeated.
Okay, Will, I guess I could let you address a little bit the fall of ISIS. Me and Will in the past have done a show, 2 shows called The Rise and Fall of ISIS, and I could link to that in the show notes if you want a deeper dive. But do you just want to kind of touch on Trump's victory lap of taking down ISIS, Will?
Yeah, sure. So we covered, I think, pretty extensively on this show, both the liberation of Mosul and perhaps to a lesser extent Raqqa. But I think these are the 2 major feathers in the Americans' cap in terms of pushing ISIS out of territory. Raqqa, of course, was the Islamic State's major capital city in Syria, and then Mosul had a very symbolic significance because that is where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, announced the creation of the caliphate from the balcony of the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul. And so these are 2 major accomplishments, of course, of the American administration. This is what Trump is going to tout for himself. But as we've also discussed extensively on this show, the American role in the rise of the Islamic State in the first place. And as listeners might know, the Islamic State comes from an al-Qaeda insurgency in Iraq, effectively. And so what we can basically expect from this alleged defeat of ISIS, whilst it certainly does constitute pushing them out of sort of their role as a statelet, they're likely just going to melt back into an insurgency in these rural areas between Iraq and Syria, the sort of lawless jihadi-stan that we've helped to create there. So I think Trump's, trumpeting a victory over ISIS might be a little premature here. And of course, there's the other aspect of the fact that using this remaining ISIS insurgency is likely going to be used to sort of keep a foothold in eastern Syria. And so there's a whole other aspect to that as well.
Right. I think part 2 is that Trump makes it out to be that this is an American victory. But really, 2 of the other countries that the United States are Donald Trump identifies as enemies in his State of the Union, Russia and Iran, have done far more than the U.S. and the allies to fight against ISIS. Russia launching a heavy campaign supporting Assad in Syria, and then Iran supporting fights against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. Somewhere, the United States really, even to this day, only fights ISIS when it's opportunist to them in Syria, and has deterred Assad from being able to fight ISIS in areas like southern Syria. Also, if you look at the actions of the United States allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, they help to fund jihadist groups, and some of those being ISIS. And in Israel has also protected some Syrian rebel groups as well, near the Syria-Israel border. I believe a group called the Golan Knights. And so it's just interesting that, we like to blame China, Russia, Iran, North Korea for everything. But if you look at, who's actually causing some of the problems and destabilization in the Middle East, it's United States allies.
Right, absolutely. Countries in our orbit. And then our avowed alleged enemies are the ones who are, the point you made, doing the lion's share to push these guys back. I mean, the Syrian Arab Army, granted they haven't only been fighting the Islamic State, but they've lost like 100,000 people. That's far more of a toll than the American military can boast.
Absolutely. And then if you look at, what the problem is here is that Donald Trump wants to permanently defeat ISIS. And it's really not possible just because, this is a problem with insurgencies. ISIS is really, a Sunni Arab insurgency out in the Anbar province of Iraq and the Raqqa province of Syria. And for the United States to try to defeat that with Kurdish suppression is only going to cause, more jihad and more insurgency. And it's simply not going to work. If it would have worked, it would have worked in Iraq, it would have worked in Afghanistan, it would have worked in Libya or Somalia or Yemen. And it's not working in any of these places. You can't just impose your will on people who don't want it imposed on them.
Right. And one last thing I'll say here, too, in regard to the Kurds, is that we are setting up the potential for later conflict down the road. Indeed, we're already seeing this with Turkey's incursion into Afrin. But yeah, our relationship with the Kurds in eastern Syria, northern Syria, is going to set us up for yet more conflict in the future.
Absolutely. Are you ready to move on to clip number 4?
Yes.
Terrorists who do things like place bombs in civilian hospitals are evil. When possible, we have no choice but to annihilate them. When necessary, we must be able to detain and question them. But we must be clear. Terrorists are not merely criminals. They are unlawful enemy combatants. And when captured overseas, they should be treated like the terrorists they are. In the past, we have foolishly released hundreds and hundreds of dangerous terrorists, only to meet them again on the battlefield, including the ISIS leader, al-Baghdadi, who we captured, who we had, who we released.
Okay, well, thanks for playing that clip. And he ends there by talking about Baghdadi and just this idea that, we rounded up all these terrorists in Iraq, and I guess he's, referring post 2003 and the fall of Saddam. So do you want to kind of go and debunk this myth that, we had all the jihadists captured and then we just let them go for no reason like we did with the now ISIS leader Baghdadi?
Yeah. I mean, Trump sort of really spins this the opposite direction of the way that I would interpret it here. He is certainly right that the United States did hold Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on 2 separate occasions, in fact. We held him both at a place called Camp Bucca, where Baghdadi was able to network and sort of meet all these fellow jihadists. And so that's one, result of holding these prisoners, is you basically give them a meeting place in a training camp or a school or a place for them to socialize and to network. However, we also held Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in the infamous Abu Ghraib prison, which I would say sort of illustrates a second problem with American detention policies, which of course includes torturing our prisoners. And of course, we know torture is really not a very effective means of getting good intelligence. And so it really boils down to either you want bad intelligence deliberately, or you have some kind of sociopathic or psychopathic, prison guards or something. But I guess we have reason to believe this is more of a higher up policy here instead of just a local slip up or local corruption in the Abu Ghraib prison. And so, yeah, in both of these instances, we had captured Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but there's many more problems with American internment policies than simply that we let people go. I think the main problems to focus on here was that we allow these jihadists to network when we arrest them, and then we also torture them and radicalize them and further create propaganda for their movements.
Yeah, I think what happens is they don't necessarily go in members of the insurgency, but they certainly come out that way. And so that's kind of the problem with the miscalculation that Trump makes, is that the solution isn't to keep them there forever, it's to not put them there in the first place. So the other thing Trump brought up in that clip was a bomb in a hospital, and this had apparently injured an American serviceman and another soldier who was at the State of the Union there, was honored and applauded for, saved his comrade and buddy. Anyways, Trump says, what kind of terrible people would put a bomb in a civilian hospital? But if you look at a number of times that Americans have bombed civilian hospitals in the Middle East, well, certainly Donald Trump and Barack Obama and George Bush are all responsible for that crime. I guess it's just so terrible that he's unable to either acknowledge that or see it.
Yeah, I would ask who is supposed to hold these American officials responsible when they plant bombs in hospitals. The world of policemen, America takes it upon itself to, detain people, indefinitely in what has been, we can get to Gitmo in a minute, but basically what is in the legal equivalent of outer space where we're locking these people. And yet we're supposed to be this country that prides itself on the rule of law and the effectiveness of our justice system. And so it's really kind of a sick thing that Trump is embracing here, this idea of these unlawful enemy combatants, and that we have to detain them sort of not under military law, not under the Geneva Conventions, and not under criminal justice law. And so it's really sort of this third category that was carved out by the Bush administration during the Iraq War of unlawful enemy combatant.
Okay, well, and Trump's going to talk about that more right ahead, so let's go ahead and play the next clip.
So today I'm keeping another promise. I just signed, prior to walking in, an order directing Secretary Mattis, who is doing a great job, thank you, to re-examine our military detention policy and to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay. I'm asking Congress to ensure that in the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we continue to have all necessary power to detain terrorists wherever we chase them down, wherever we find them. And in many cases, for them, it will now be Guantanamo Bay.
Okay, well, so the audience was very excited for that clip. What was your reaction to it?
Yeah, the first thing I guess I thought about in terms of Guantanamo Bay is at least five prisoners who are there now that have been cleared for release, but yet still languish, in the prison. And I think that really illustrates sort of the injustice of this method of detainment. As I mentioned, it's sort of a third way between the laws of war and where the Geneva Conventions would apply, and between criminal law. And so now we can just hold these people forever in this jail cell in Cuba. And never, clear them for release, tell these guys that they're free to go, they're not charged with anything, but yet we're still holding them there, inexplicably.
Right. A couple things I would note was, this is only an order for Mattis to look at it. I think I know that Mattis's policy is, he was the guy who told Trump that I could do more with like a 6-pack of beer and a pack of cigarettes than I could with torture. And so if Mattis is the one that's been scheduled to undergo this review, at least maybe, even if we see a return of sending detainees to Guantanamo Bay, if it's not a torture camp, it still looks bad, but it's not as bad. I would hate for, to go back to a situation where the American government is torturing people in Guantanamo Bay on my behalf. That's really disgusting. The second thing, with it just being an order, who knows what comes of this. This may just be Trump trying to attract attention to this for whatever reason. One thing that was pretty concerning is that they say he wanted to chase terrorists anywhere. The anywhere word seems to apply the United States of America. And so if Congress is going to give Donald Trump, of all people, the power to just start throwing people in Guantanamo Bay, we may all be in a little bit more trouble than we were, thinking that with Donald Trump, because that's, an awful lot of very dangerous power.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there are some sort of dangerous precedents, not so much with there are dangerous precedents with the internment, but specifically with like American citizens like Anwar al-Awlaki, who've been considered sort of enemy combatants and just worthy of summary execution, basically on a kill list. And so if that kind of authority expands to American soil, yeah, that's truly a alarming and ominous development.
Right. And I guess the other problem with this policy is that the United States just needs to close Guantanamo Bay. At this point, I'm sure it does a lot more benefit to the jihadist groups and the Salafists than does, could ever be done good, even if torture worked, just because, it's a propaganda piece for them. Everybody knows that the United States tortures people there. And so if, they could say to, all the young kids growing up, hey, the Americans will come swoop you up and throw you in a jail. Look, their president says it. Then, that's very strong anti-American propaganda that they have.
Yeah, I mean, it plays directly into the Islamic State, specifically their strategy of what they call like destroying the gray zone, which they consider to be the area of ambiguity between radical Islam and the West. And so if they can show their young people, say, hey, look, the West are hypocrites. They don't actually care about the rule of law. They'll torture you and lock you up indefinitely because you're Muslim or for whatever reason. But that sort of directly serves that sort of propaganda narrative where they're trying to destroy what they call the gray zone.
Right. Okay, let's move on to clip number 6.
As of a few months ago, our warriors in Afghanistan have new rules of engagement. Along with their heroic Afghan partners, our military is no longer undermined by artificial timelines, and we no longer tell our enemies our plans.
Okay, well, I know we've broken down Afghan policy on this show before, and I'm going to go ahead and link in the show notes to an episode where we get into it heavily. But his, kind of suggestions to fix the problem here are, we don't have the timetables, we're not going to tell people what we're doing with the troop numbers, and we're going to take our hands off on rules of engagement. So just how has this worked in the past?
Yeah, of course, under Barack Obama in 2009, we witnessed a massive troop surge in the country that saw the total troop numbers there swell over to over 100,000. And right now, I don't believe the current troop total under Trump surpasses 15,000. And so if Barack Obama's troop surge failed with over 100,000 soldiers occupying the country, it is just, it's ludicrous to expect that something shy of 15,000 is going to be able to accomplish what that didn't, just because we are staying there indefinitely and now no longer have a timetable or any kind of, plan to leave, to withdraw at a specific time.
Well, I mean, we don't even have a coherent strategy. I was looking and we were talking today about the national security strategy where Trump outlines that the United States plan was going to be to force the Taliban to the table with a heavier bombardment and everything. And now the United States is saying that we're not going to negotiate with the Taliban. And so there's really no way to win if you're not willing to negotiate, because America, I guess, we're, not looking to kill all the Pashtuns, because that's the other option if you're not willing to negotiate one with them.
Right, absolutely. I mean, this has sort of been, I think, like the implicit kind of like framework for a long time for Afghan policy is that someday we'll pressure the Taliban into the negotiation table, because certainly this decades-long insurgency just seems to have no end in sight. So now the Trump administration is basically saying, no, talks with the Taliban are now off the table. Well, and now he has no timetable to get out of there. This is just spelling, endless occupation. In Afghanistan, we've had some of the hardest time with the insurgency. You mentioned how America has a very hard time fighting insurgencies. Afghanistan is a perfect example of this.
Right. And like I said, me and Will have talked about the Afghan issue quite extensively on the show in the past, and I'll link to one of those shows. Let's move on to the next clip.
Last month, I also took an action endorsed unanimously by the U.S. Senate just months before. I recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Shortly afterwards, dozens of countries voted in the United Nations General Assembly against America's sovereign right to make this decision. In 2016, American taxpayers generously sent those same countries more than $20 billion in aid. That is why tonight I am asking Congress to pass legislation to help ensure American foreign assistance dollars always serve American interests and only go to friends of America.
All right, well, let's start with the beginning of that clip. Trump mentions that he moved the capital, or the U.S. recognition of the Israeli capital, to Jerusalem. Why is this important?
Well, as your viewers, or as your listeners might know, Jerusalem is the site of many holy relics and holy sites, holy locations for the three Abrahamic religions. And so that alone really makes Jerusalem this hot spot where, several different factions have their eye on it. But specifically, of course, it's been occupied by Israel, I believe, since 1948. And they stepped that up in 1967. And the American recognition of this being Israel's undivided capital is basically paving the way for outright annexation of the city by the Israelis, because it's sort of rubber stamping this long-standing Israeli desire to have Jerusalem as their capital. Now, of course, the original UN partition plan had Jerusalem as sort of this internationally mediated, divided city where, the Palestinians and the Israelis get equal shares of it. But what the Trump administration has just done is basically to endorse this idea that Israel will unilaterally have Jerusalem as, for itself, as its capital.
Right. I think there's been a long kind of march towards the unveiling that there's not going to be a two-state solution. And I think for, probably the people living there, this was a pretty large step and a pretty noticeable one. And while it may have been the case for a long time that Jerusalem was never going to be a divided city or a shared city or an international city, it was going to be a, Israeli city, with the United States movement announcement, us being the world hegemon and the people who have taken it upon themselves as the negotiators between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It was a pretty clear sign that there's just not going to be a two-state solution, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this is sort of where I think we've gotten a bum deal with Trump, because Trump has sold himself as this bucker of the international order of certain trends in the world. And in this case here, he is bucking this trend, but it's one of the only good trends there are in the international order, which was sort of this de facto, this unwillingness to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. That had been sort of a long-standing policy, and now Trump came and overturned that.
Okay, and so then Trump moves into complaining about the UN and how the UN voted against the United States move of the embassy to Jerusalem. I don't have a whole lot to say about that. I see the UN as a pretty useless organization in general. I kind of wish it didn't exist because it really seems to only either legitimize or protect the war crimes of the United States, and then condemn the actions of anybody the United States or our allies don't like. Examples of Saudi blackmailing their way off the list of the states that injure children because they're starving all the Yemeni children to death.
Sure, absolutely. And I thought the other interesting part of this was, of course, his chastising of the fact that, America gives foreign aid to these other countries who voted against this decision. But it's very ironic that he's talking about this in the same breath as Israel, because Israel is the number one recipient of American foreign aid. And one of the points he makes here is that we should only give money to friends of America, not, adversaries or whatever. However, in the case of Israel, I think there's a long history to examine there that would really show that Israel has not been much of an ally to the United States. I mean, even going back to things like the USS Liberty incident, where, of course, the Israelis attacked an American spy ship.
Right, and on the last show I had talked about how the Israelis' poor treatment of the Palestinians has provoked a lot of people and radicalized a lot of jihadists, and I think was cited by some of the 9/11 hijackers.
Yeah, Mohammed Atta and the Hamburg cell, those guys were enraged about Israeli policies. And Osama bin Laden himself even referred to this. Not only Israel's treatment of the Arabs of Palestine, but also America's support for this.
Right. And then just one of the few, I guess, foreign policy moves that I somewhat support from Trump would be his, saying that he's going to cut the aid to these other countries. I guess one of the bigger and unfortunate things is he's only cutting aid to the countries that I don't necessarily mind him cutting aid to, where I'd rather him be cutting aid to Israel first. I think he's going in the wrong order, but as a libertarian, I never mind any attempts to cut down on government spending.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure to say that too, that I support any cut of foreign aid to other countries. This foreign aid often ends up going to support dictators or despots or buying weapons that slaughter people. So yeah, it's no good.
All right, let's move on to the next clip.
As we strengthen friendships all around the world, we are also restoring clarity about our adversaries. When the people of Iran rose up against the crimes of their corrupt dictatorship, I did not stay silent. America stands with the people of Iran in their courageous struggle for freedom.
Okay, Will, so the United States supports the people of Iran, even though those protests were pretty weak. Of all the things for Trump to really discuss with Iran, I guess this probably wasn't the worst. Yeah. He could have talked about, the Iranian influence or interventionism in other countries. But what did you think about this general discussion about Iran?
Sure, I actually agree that him opening the Iran issue by talking about the protesters was preferable to some totally belligerent kind of hostile thing about Iran. And I think there's a lot of interesting things that are going on with this Iranian opposition. But I think the United States ought to be careful about what sort of opposition factions that we get behind in Iran. Republicans and I think Democrats too have been behind groups like the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, this weird left-wing jihadist organization in Iran. And they've been a long-time dissident group there. And also groups like Jundallah, who I think are more like outright like Salafist groups. And so there is certainly sort of like a moderate opposition that opposes the Ayatollah and maybe favors moderates like Rouhani. But of course, there's also this element of the Iranian opposition that is radical and probably not worth supporting. And so that's something I would at least point out there in terms of talking about the Iranian opposition.
Right. The first thing is, how has this gone in Iraq and Syria? It's gone extremely poorly, so maybe we don't want to do it again. Also, I guess just kind of one of Trump's big policy things against Iran is we need to have more sanctions against Iran. But one of the things that, I don't know if it's fair to say stifled the protests, but certainly didn't make them any easier, is that United States sanctions against Iran keep some American social media companies from operating within Iran because they believe it violates the sanctions to provide their services to that country. And so if you're trying to use apps and get around the Iraqi government or Iranian government, you need certain services. And, the United States government was cutting them off.
Yeah, it's certainly a contradictory policy there. And as you said, our history of backing protest movements has not been good. I mean, if you look at in Syria, if you look at in Ukraine, the sort of neo-Nazi Hitler brigades that we backed there, certainly not a good history there.
Yeah, the Mujahideen going all the way back, right? In Afghanistan, we have a long history of it. All right, do you want to move on with the next clip?
Sure.
Fundamental flaws in the terrible Iran nuclear deal. My administration has also imposed tough sanctions on the communist and socialist dictatorships in Cuba and Venezuela.
All right, so we have Trump complaining about the nuclear deal and then imposing sanctions against the people in Venezuela and Cuba. And likewise, there may be, if not now down the road, some problems with U.S. sanctions keeping the protesters from both in Venezuela and Cuba from using some technologies. But do you want to talk about the Iran nuclear deal, Will?
Sure. I thought this clip was kind of bizarre. It's like he starts it, like, it sounds like one single sentence that he says here. It's like he starts talking about Iran, and then it's like he finishes the next clause with the thing about Venezuela and Cuba. It's kind of weird. However, it's very, I think, illustrative how skimpy he is on the Iran deal here. He just says it has these major flaws, but does not specify one. And I think that's sort of been a trend with Donald Trump this whole time, is not specifying any flaws of the deal. And then, of course, his administration's actual actions, picking on Iran over their ballistic missile tests, which really don't have any relation to the nuclear deal. So obviously, it's not the deal he has a problem with. He just is looking for a problem with Iran.
Absolutely. Even when he was able to decertify the deal, it was in violation of the spirit of the deal, which, when they're using the spirit of the deal, they're really not violating the deal.
Right. And I mean, if anybody's violated not only the spirit, but even the letter of the deal, it would be Trump and his administration. Because Trump in public speeches to, foreign delegates or foreign, in foreign countries, speeches before foreign governments is what I'm trying to say, excuse me. He urges them to not do business with Iran, which is sort of stipulated in the deal that the United States cannot put pressure on its allies to not do business with the Iranians. And so that if it's not a violation of the letter of the deal, it is a violation of the spirit of it.
All right. And do you have anything you would like to add on Venezuela or Cuba?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's funny, these two issues, the Iran deal and at least the issue of trade relations with Cuba, these are the two things that I think Barack Obama did right, that I actually applauded him for, was the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and sort of, I forget specifically what he did with Cuba, but I believe he liberalized trade relations. And it's sort of disappointing to see Trump try to roll back those two singular good things that Obama had done.
Yeah, I think Obama was working to normalize relations with Cuba, allowing some travel. I think there are maybe still some U.S. ambassadors or an envoy to Cuba from the United States and vice versa. So, the relationships are still better than they were before Obama, but Trump is certainly moving the wrong direction on that. And would you like to play the final clip, Will?
Yeah, sure.
Has oppressed its own citizens more totally or brutally than the cruel dictatorship in North Korea. North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear missiles could very soon threaten our homeland. We are waging a campaign of maximum pressure to prevent that from ever happening. Past experience has taught us that complacency and concessions only invite aggression and provocation. I will not repeat the mistakes of past administrations that got us into this very dangerous position. We need only look at the depraved character of the North Korean regime to understand the nature of the nuclear threat it could pose to America and to our allies.
Okay, well, I guess we could just start with, what kind of threat does North Korea pose to the United States and our allies?
Well, I guess to get to very specific here, I guess we don't really know, because there's sort of it's unclear what North Korea's, not only their intercontinental ballistic missile capability is, it's not really clear how far they could reach a strike, but it's also not clear if they've even really developed proper nuclear technology in terms of weapons. Like, have they miniaturized a warhead and made it fit on an ICBM? So we really don't know what the threat is from North Korea here. However, North Korea knows plenty well what the threat is from the United States. They certainly see our military exercises and war games that we do with their southern neighbor right on their border there. So certainly it's clear what the American threat is to the North Koreans.
Right. I know we talked about North Korea a lot just kind of through the first couple clips of the show, but he really ends here with North Korea and then has two stories, first about Otto Warmbier and then about, like I said in the opening, a North Korean man who escaped the brutal regime there and has overcome a lot and seems like a pretty great guy. So I guess it's just interesting how heavily he works to demonize the North Korean regime through these the stories of these two men. And as we kind of saw, I think, through Trump's speech, he really tried to use these emotional kind of stories to push where he felt was most important. And so maybe we kind of see that this is where Trump feels most important right now in foreign policy. And what he's saying is that my policy is going to be, to really pursue the Kim Jong-un regime and pressure them into giving up their nuclear weapons.
Right, absolutely. And another, I think, ironic thing about one of those, the Korean defector, I think this is right, that his travel ban would have prevented that defector from coming here when it was in place. And so, that's I don't know, that he's touting this guy and using this defector as a weapon against the North Korean regime, but his own policy would have prevented him from coming here.
Right, I think up until maybe yesterday, maybe this is why it happened. The United States lifted the ban on refugees from North Korea and 10 other countries. And so it would be interesting if that happened to let this guy in the country, but that's just kind of a note. Do you have anything else to add about North Korea, Will?
I guess I would just comment on the fate of Otto Warmbier. Now, of course, it's tragic what happened to this kid. He came back. He was arrested. For those who don't know, Otto Warmbier was arrested in North Korea for some trivial offense of stealing a poster or something. And it's said that he was sentenced to 15 years hard labor and that he was mistreated and tortured and malnourished and stuff. And he basically came back to the United States in a coma and died shortly after. However, it's really not totally clear what happened to this guy. Was he mistreated by the North Korean regime? I have no real reason to doubt that. However, there was also conflicting accounts that said that he may have inflicted self-harm, that he may have, harmed himself in custody. And there were also some insightful North Korea analysts who were saying that it's not likely this Warmbier would have been put in the sort of penal labor system of North Korea. They wouldn't have put a Westerner in to see that and to be a witness to that. However, who knows? Maybe he ended up there and then they figured they had to destroy the evidence, so to speak. And so that's just the Trump administration spoke as if it was a very clear-cut kind of case of the North Korean regime committing this crime. But I don't know if it's totally clear what actually happened there.
Right. It's absolutely a crime, either way. But there's definitely a difference between, some sadistic person that tortures all their detainees and a group that, at least tries to treat their prisoners correctly.
Yeah, they had alleged that this Warmbier had botulism. The North Korean said this when he came back, which his symptoms didn't really seem to match that, so that's suspicious, of course. But again, it's very murky what happened there.
Right. And on my show, I think I pointed out at the time that I can't imagine what the conditions are like in a North Korean prison, but just looking at how the people outside the prison live, I guess it's not impossible. That was just, government incompetence. They fed them bad food. The doctor was bad. They gave him bad medicine that didn't work, and misdiagnosis and stuff like that. I guarantee you, if there's one place on the planet nobody would ever go for medical care, and it's probably North Korea.
Right, absolutely. That's a very good point.
All right, well, so I think that about covers everything that actually, Trump's 6 minutes or so of foreign policy in the speech. What did you overall think of it, the takeaways from the State of the Union and everything else?
Well, of course, I think like all State of the Union addresses, this really was just sort of like an outpouring of platitudes and slogans and stuff, which is really kind of a common thing we get not only from the State of the Union, but from, as we covered, the national security strategy. And I think something that's notable here is sort of the echoing of the framing of how the national security strategy frames foreign policy issues, how he's echoing them in this speech. And so the three the three groups of threats, the terrorists, the rogue regimes of North Korea and Iran, and then Russia and China. I think this is fundamentally probably the most dangerous way to frame our foreign policy discussion here as, enemies, the axis of evil we're facing. It's sort of a Bushian kind of approach to foreign policy. And I think that maybe stood out as being the most alarming overall.
I agree. The other thing I thought was really alarming is Trump's use of the kind of anecdotal emotional stories, not just in foreign policy, but throughout the speech, pointing to victims of people that were maybe killed by immigrants or something else as reasons that we needed to enforce the other policies of Donald Trump. I think early on in the speech, he talked about a young boy, like a 12-year-old boy, that put a bunch of flags on graves of soldiers. Of course, nobody ever talks about Trump putting those soldiers in those graves, but, Trump will certainly use that young man and those graves to stand up and say we all need to come together as Americans and support interventionism.
Certainly. I thought sort of his use of the emotional pleas, too, was kind of sickening at some points. Sort of as we were discussing before we went on air, sort of trying to use people's like sadness and empathy with these poor victims and sort of translating that into his own power, into his own influence. Like, because I'm pointing out this sad situation, you should like me now more. And sort of on his use of defectors, particularly from North Korea, I think that's very reminiscent of like a Cold War strategy, of using defectors against the evil empire of the Soviet Union. So I think that's sort of a interesting note too.
All right, well, and just kind of as a last thing, was there anything positive that you were maybe able to see from Trump's, if you have to go the speech in general, but there's something from maybe the foreign policy section that you thought wasn't that bad or was good?
The foreign policy section, it's really hard to find anything that's promising in there. A lot of it is just restatements of things that we've already disagreed with and we already oppose. However, there were other things in the speech where he talked about prison reform and he talked about the right to try laws and stuff. And personally, as a libertarian, I think those are important issues. Unfortunately, though, on the foreign policy front, it doesn't seem there's much to write home about.
Right. I think the best thing on foreign policy is that Trump did not conflate Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. For the first time in the Trump administration, a Trump official did not make that mistake by saying the terrorist groups Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Hezbollah. So I will give him credit for that. I hope that was is a serious policy recognition and not necessarily just an oversight. I guess it's a good thing that he didn't talk a lot about specifics. I was hoping that he wasn't going to say, we're carrying out a bloody nose strike against North Korea as I speak or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
So, nothing catastrophic is my positive news. And thanks everybody for tuning in to today's show. Me and Will have been at it for a while now, listening to Trump's speech, and then pretty much immediately after setting up and recording, I'm sure we're both pretty tired, so we're going to wrap up the show here. Will, do you have anywhere you'd like to send people or anything you'd like to suggest?
Oh, yeah, sure. If you're interested in finding my writing, you can find me at the Libertarian Institute and the featured articles in the blog section there. And they also run some of my stuff at antiwar.com in the viewpoints section. My Twitter is WKPANCAP, ANCAP. I used to write for a site called The Daily Sheeple, where I've got like a couple hundred articles there, news and commentary. So if you're interested, that's where you can find me.
And you can find this show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, or the Facebook page Libertarian Union. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle.